Welcome to American Aftermath. Tonight, we'll trace the entire story of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Overnight, word spread that the president had been shot at Ford's Theater, and by morning, church bells and black-draped streets told people he was gone. Families who had just survived 4 years of war now faced the loss of the man who led them, while newly freed Black Americans wondered what his death would mean for their hard-won freedom. Across the country, grief mixed with fear as the United States stepped into Reconstruction without Lincoln's guidance and tried to imagine what kind of nation it would become now. We'll take our time and keep an easy pace. We'll stay close to the people who lived through it, and to the quiet ways this assassination still shows up in American life today. Before we begin, if you find comfort in calm retellings of the days that broke and reshaped America, you're welcome to subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, settle back, and let the rest of the day drift while we ease into tonight's story. Before we sit with that night in Ford's Theater and the quiet vigil that followed, we need to step back and spend a little time in the America Lincoln was trying to hold together. To understand why his death could shake the country so deeply, we have to see what life felt like in the divided republic he led before the shot was fired. Years before Lincoln's assassination, the United States was already a country stretched thin over questions of slavery, power, and belonging. In the middle of the 19th century, it was a nation growing fast in land and population, but not in shared understanding of what that growth should mean. Factories, farms, plantations, and new towns all pulled in different directions while sharing one flag. From a distance, it could look steady, yet tension ran quietly through daily life. In the northern states, many people woke to the sound of mill whistles, shop doors opening, and train wheels on steel rails. Cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia were crowded with immigrants, clerks, dock workers, and small business owners who counted coins at simple wooden counters. Newspapers carried stories about European revolutions and railroad plans. For many families there, slavery felt physically distant, even as their economy was tied to cotton and southern trade. Across the South, mournings began on plantations where enslaved men, women, and children were forced into fields before the sun had fully risen. Cotton, tobacco, and rice brought money that supported white planters, professionals, and merchants in towns with brick courthouses and wide main streets. The law treated enslaved people as property, not citizens, and that belief sat at the heart of Southern power. In that world, any challenge to slavery felt like a challenge to status, safety, and identity. The political system tried to keep the country together through careful bargains that never fully solved the conflict. In Washington, senators and representatives argued inside tall, echoing chambers while crowds listened from wooden galleries. The Missouri Compromise had once drawn a line on a map, allowing slavery in some new territories and forbidding it in others. For a time, that line seemed like a wall holding back deeper arguments, but pressure continued to build behind it. By 1850, the growth of California and other Western lands forced Congress to reopen old wounds. The Compromise of 1850 admitted California as a free state and adjusted borders, but it also created a harsher Fugitive Slave Act. That law demanded that even free states help return escapees to bondage. In northern cities, people watched federal officers lead captured fugitives through streets lined with brick buildings and crowded sidewalks. Each march under guard made the moral split between regions more visible and harder to ignore. A few years later, the Kansas-Nebraska Act opened new territories to the possibility of slavery through local votes, tearing up the older line that had once tried to limit expansion. Settlers hurried into Kansas with rifles packed beside plows and family Bibles. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery groups formed rival governments, and town streets became places of raids, arson, and sudden attacks. The phrase "Bleeding Kansas" entered newspapers as a grim shorthand for what compromise could no longer contain. In courtrooms, the conflict appeared in a quieter but still powerful form. The Dred Scott decision in 1857 declared that black people, whether enslaved or free, could not be citizens under the Constitution. It also claimed Congress had little right to keep slavery out of the territories. When news of the ruling spread through offices and train stations, some Americans felt that the law was closing its doors on equality. Others celebrated the decision as a shield around their way of life. Long before Lincoln's assassination, Abraham Lincoln himself grew up far from these marble buildings and crowded chambers. He was born in a small one-room cabin in Kentucky, then moved with his family to rough clearings in Indiana, and later to Illinois. Chopping wood, tending fields, and reading by firelight gave him a sense of both physical labor and restless curiosity. Neighbors remembered a tall, quiet young man who borrowed books whenever he could, copying passages by hand to fix ideas in his memory. As a young lawyer riding the circuit in Illinois, Lincoln learned how ordinary disputes reflected larger rules and beliefs. He traveled by horse and buggy between small towns, carrying papers in saddlebags and sharing jokes in taverns at night. In simple courthouses, he argued over debts, land, and contracts, while judges listened from high wooden benches. Those years taught him how different kinds of people spoke and thought, from farmers to merchants to local politicians. Lincoln entered politics as a member of the Whig Party, which believed in internal improvements, economic growth, and a strong but balanced federal government. He served in the Illinois legislature and later spent a single term in Congress during the Mexican-American War. In Washington, he saw slavery close at hand when he walked past slave pens and auctions in a capital that sat between free and slave states. After his term ended, he returned to law practice, thinking his public life might be over. The Kansas-Nebraska Act pulled Lincoln back into the political arena with new urgency. He saw the act as a dangerous step that could spread slavery into lands that had once been promised as free. In speeches across Illinois, he spoke to crowds gathered in town squares and fairgrounds, using simple language about right and wrong. He did not call for immediate equality in every respect, but he insisted that the nation should not keep extending a system that treated human beings as property. By 1858, Lincoln was challenging Senator Stephen Douglas for his seat, and the Lincoln-Douglas debates carried their arguments to fields and fairgrounds across the state. Wooden platforms were built in open-air spaces where farmers, shopkeepers, and families stood for hours under sun or clouds. Douglas defended popular sovereignty, letting local voters decide on slavery in new territories. Lincoln argued that allowing slavery to spread would place the country on a path where its core ideals could not survive. Those debates did not give Lincoln the Senate seat, but they made his name known far beyond Illinois. Newspapers printed long transcripts, and people in distant states read his plain but pointed language at kitchen tables and in railway waiting rooms. The Republican Party, still relatively young, saw in him a figure who could speak against the expansion of slavery without sounding like a radical threat to every white voter. That balance mattered in a country where fear traveled as quickly as news. As the presidential election of 1860 approached, America's political map fractured along familiar but sharper lines. The Democratic Party split into northern and southern wings that nominated different candidates. A smaller constitutional Union Party tried to hold on to a narrow platform of preserving the Union and the Constitution without clear answers on slavery. In many homes, conversations around lamplight turned toward which candidate might protect livelihoods and honor, and which one might bring ruin. When Lincoln won the presidency with strong Northern support and no electoral votes from the Deep South, the result felt like a breaking point in many Southern capitals. Leaders who had long warned about a Republican victory now argued that the moment for leaving the Union had finally arrived. In state conventions held in tall, echoing halls, delegates signed ordinances of secession that they framed as a defense of state rights and their slave-based economy. Church bells rang and cannons fired as crowds cheered decisions that would soon bring war. In the months between the election and his inauguration, Lincoln faced a Union that was already shrinking. South Carolina moved first, followed by several other slave states that formed the Confederacy. Federal forts and arsenals in those states became contested spaces with divided loyalties among their officers. Families wrote anxious letters as rumors of armed clashes and seizures of property spread along telegraph lines and dusty roads. Peace still held on paper, but distrust deepened with every new report. Lincoln's journey to Washington for his inauguration took him by train through cities filled with marching bands, banners, and uneasy crowds. He stopped to speak in state capitals and public squares where he promised to uphold the Constitution and keep federal property under national control. At the same time, secret reports reached advisors about possible plots against his life. Security remained loose by later standards, and the idea of a president traveling largely in public was still treated as normal. After the attack on Fort Sumter in April 1861, when Confederate guns opened fire on a federal fort in Charleston Harbor, war moved from threat to reality. Lincoln called for volunteers, and young men from farms, towns, and cities filled recruiting offices with nervous energy. In the North, many believed the conflict would be short and decisive. In the South, crowds also expected a quick victory that would secure independence and protect slavery. Both hopes underestimated the scale of what was unfolding. Through the first hard years of fighting, Lincoln learned how to lead a war in an age of telegraphs and mass armies. He spent long nights in the War Department's telegraph office, reading messages from the front as rain tapped on window panes. Generals came and went from his confidence as victories and failures changed public opinion. Newspapers printed casualty lists that reached into almost every community, building pressure on leaders in both capitals. The question of slavery pressed more heavily as the war dragged on. Enslaved people escaped to Union lines, seeking protection near forts and encampments where tents and supply wagons stretched across fields. Commanders on the ground had to decide how to treat these men, women, and children who saw the advancing blue uniforms as a path to freedom. Their choices gradually pushed national policy toward recognizing that the war's outcome would decide not only union or secession, but bondage or freedom. By the time Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, announcing that enslaved people in rebelling states would be free as Union forces advanced, the moral center of the war had shifted. Black men began serving in Union uniforms, drilling in camps that had once excluded them. Their service showed courage amid extra danger and unequal pay. In homes across the country, families wrestled with the idea that the future United States might be a place where slavery no longer existed by law. On the home front, strain appeared in food prices, missing husbands and sons, and crowded hospitals. Northern cities saw draft riots and protests when conscription laws fell unevenly on working-class neighborhoods. In the Confederacy, shortages, inflation, and battlefield defeats eroded early confidence. Clerks in both governments counted supplies, signed papers, and tried to mask their own fears as they stamped orders and read the latest reports. The war touched nearly every routine, from church services to harvests. As unions between states frayed, Lincoln guided the Union through disagreement inside his own government as well. He balanced radical Republicans who wanted faster change and harsh punishment for the South with moderates and border state leaders who feared too much disruption. Cabinet meetings in the White House brought sharp opinions into close quarters, with maps spread on tables and cigar smoke in the air. The president listened, argued, and often carried heavy decisions alone late into the night. Elections still took place even in the middle of this conflict, and the presidential race of 1864 tested the country's will to continue. For a time, it appeared that Lincoln might lose, especially when casualties mounted and victories were slow. Union soldiers voted from camps and field stations, sending their ballots back through channels that had to be carefully managed. When he did win a second term, it signaled that many voters were prepared to see the war through under his leadership. By early 1865, major Confederate armies were weakening under pressure from Union campaigns. Sherman's march through Georgia and into the Carolinas left railroad tracks twisted and storehouses emptied, breaking much of the Confederacy's supply system. Grant's forces pressed Lee's army near Richmond and Petersburg as trenches scarred the landscape. In weathered tents and crowded hospitals, soldiers sensed that the end was close, though no one knew exactly when or how it would come. When General Lee finally surrendered to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, it did not instantly end all fighting. but it marked the collapse of the main Confederate Army in Virginia. News traveled by telegraph and horse, and people in northern cities poured into streets hung with flags and banners. Church bells rang, bands played, and strangers embraced under gas lamps. In those celebrations, however, questions about what peace would look like for 4 million newly freed people and for former Confederates were only beginning. Lincoln's second inaugural address, spoken on the steps of the Capitol with rain streaking down and a war-weary crowd listening, gave a glimpse of his hopes for reconciliation. He spoke of binding up the nation's wounds and moving forward with firmness in doing what seemed right while avoiding personal bitterness. To many listeners, the words suggested a future where punishment would be tempered by mercy. Among others, especially hardline Confederates and white supremacists, those signals brought anger and resentment instead of relief. In the former slave states, freedom arrived in uneven and fragile ways. Some enslaved people heard the news directly from Union soldiers riding into towns framed by worn wooden fences. Others waited for months until federal authority truly reached them. The promise of land, voting rights, and protection under law was still unclear and often unreliable. White resistance, from legal maneuvers to open violence, began almost immediately as the old order tried to preserve as much power as it could. Inside Washington, the wartime White House remained a surprisingly open place where citizens could often line up to seek favors, jobs, or pardons. Lincoln met visitors in crowded anterooms and in his office, listening to personal stories that ranged from desperate pleas to small requests. Security around the president was far more informal than it would become in later eras. Guards were present, but there was no permanent protective agency dedicated to watching every doorway and escorting him at all times. Theaters, churches, and public events offered chances for the president and his family to step briefly away from military maps and official papers. Ford's Theater was one of several venues where he could listen to music and laughter in a crowded hall. Actors and politicians sometimes shared the same social world of dinners, receptions, and backstage visits. In that environment, people who admired the president and those who hated him could move in overlapping spaces. By the final weeks before Lincoln's assassination, the divided republic he led had survived the war, but had not yet settled its future. The Union was preserved in name, and slavery was dying in law. Yet bitterness and fear still flowed through parlors, taverns, and campfires. Leaders debated how to reconstruct shattered states and rebuild trust on streets still marked by soldiers' boots. In that fragile moment, when celebration and rage lived side by side, the stage was set for a violent act that would try to reshape the victory he had helped secure. Lincoln's assassination can only be understood by traveling back through the war years when emancipation slowly reshaped the conflict and hatred hardened in many American hearts. At first, the fighting was officially about Union, flags, and forts, but nearly every month pulled slavery further into the center. In farmhouses, boarding houses, and crowded city streets, people argued over what the war truly meant for their families and for the country that claimed them. Some saw a chance to save the Union with slavery unchanged. Others imagined a future without bondage, and many simply wanted the drums and marching to stop. Beneath those hopes and fears, sharper resentments waited quietly to surface. For enslaved people across the South, the outbreak of war sounded at first like distant thunder, carried by rumors that Union troops might bring some kind of change. On plantations bordered by split rail fences and thin dirt roads, whispers moved from cabin to cabin after dark. People weighed the risks of running toward federal lines against the dangers of staying under overseers who might grow harsher as fear spread. Each small act of resistance, from slowing work in the fields to sharing news across property lines, carried both hope and real risk. For them, the war seemed less a distant contest and more a narrow opening toward freedom itself. In the North, young men who enlisted often spoke first about duty to the Union rather than about slavery. Yet the meaning of that duty shifted as the war dragged on. They left behind small shops, city tenements, and prairie farms, promising families that the absence would be brief and the cause clear. Around campfires that flickered against rows of stacked muskets, soldiers argued about politics and race while writing careful letters home that hid most of their worry. Some spoke bitterly about abolitionists. Some slowly changed their minds after seeing slavery near the front, and some held their beliefs quietly and watched. The fighting slowly revised what loyalty meant. Confederate soldiers marched under different flags and stories, many convinced they were defending home, honor, and a social order built on the unpaid labor of black people. Letters found their way back to towns with whitewashed churches and red clay streets, describing fears that a Union victory would overturn long-standing hierarchies. In camp and at home, preachers and politicians repeated warnings that emancipation would bring chaos, crime, and revenge. Images meant to tighten loyalty through fear. Every rumor about armed black regiments or federal orders circled through smoky rooms and beneath live oak trees, making compromise seem weaker and hostility more righteous. In that climate, anger thickened into devotion. When Lincoln announced the Emancipation Proclamation, many Americans first read about it in crowded newspaper offices where boys shouted headlines into winter air. In northern cities, bells rang in some churches, while other pulpits warned that freeing enslaved people would cost white workers their jobs. Crowds gathered at street corners framed by gas lamps and brick walls, debating whether the proclamation was a bold step toward justice or an unnecessary provocation. In Confederate territory, word of the decree stirred a different heat, feeding fears that Union victory would pull down the entire structure of white dominance. Plantation households spoke in guarded tones, while enslaved families listened and weighed faint possibilities. As black regiments formed under the United States flag, their very presence on drill fields shook long-held beliefs about who could wear a uniform and bear arms. In Union camps, white soldiers watched lines of black volunteers march by, some cheering, some uneasy, some openly hostile. For the men stepping into those new regiments, the risk went beyond ordinary battlefield danger, since capture by Confederate forces could mean execution or sale into bondage. Across the South, news of armed black soldiers hardened white resistance, nurturing a belief among extremists that defeat would bring not only loss, but humiliation at the hands of former slaves. That fear fed darker plans. Hatred did not belong to one region alone, and in northern streets it sometimes surfaced in riots and angry meetings where white workers blamed black neighbors for wages and war itself. During the New York draft riots, mobs surged through avenues lined with brick row houses and wooden shops, attacking symbols of authority and turning on black residents in terrifying bursts of violence. Newspapers reported smashed windows, fires, and lynchings, scenes that exposed how fragile solidarity could be when fear and resentment were stirred. Peace Democrats and critics, often called copperheads, met in back rooms and public halls, accusing Lincoln of waging a cruel, unnecessary conflict that trampled civil liberties. War weariness deepened with every season, filling kitchen tables with empty chairs and making casualty lists in the newspaper feel like cold daily rituals. Widows in dresses faded by repeated washing stood in line for pensions, while neighbors offered food, small coins, and sometimes criticism if they disliked a family's politics. Governments on both sides issued orders about property, conscription, and loyalty oaths, measures that touched ordinary routines and sometimes felt like distant authorities reaching into private lives. For some citizens, each new regulation confirmed their belief that leaders were careless with freedom, a feeling that could harden into personal hatred for the man in the White House. Resentment deepened. Throughout the war, Lincoln read newspapers that praised him as savior and condemned him as tyrant, often on the same day, with caricatures that exaggerated his height, face, and supposed coldness. Stacks of letters arrived at the White House, ink on thin paper carrying appeals, blessings, demands, and explicit threats from strangers who used his name as a target for every frustration. In some editorials, his policies on emancipation and civil liberties were painted as unforgivable crimes against the Constitution, language that could feed reckless minds already searching for someone to blame. Open criticism was ordinary in a republic, yet repeated cries for vengeance landed around him with little filter. Washington, during the later war years, was a city of contrasts, where newly freed people, wounded soldiers, foreign diplomats, and Southern sympathizers shared the same muddy streets and smoky taverns. Boarding houses close to the Capitol held clerks copying orders upstairs, while downstairs visitors argued fiercely about generals, casualties, and the future of slavery. Maryland and Virginia, which touched the capital on both sides of the Potomac, were full of families divided in loyalty, making espionage and quiet resistance part of everyday talk. In theaters, hotels, and parlor rooms filled with soft chairs and patterned carpets, Confederate sympathizers sometimes spoke freely, confident that the city would never fully silence them. Whispers, as victory for the Union grew more likely, the mixture of grief, defeat, and racial fear began to crystallize in certain circles into a focused hatred of Lincoln himself. In Richmond, Baltimore, and border towns, hardline secessionists gathered in back rooms with drawn curtains, trading stories about ruined fortunes and imagined outrages done by the administration. Secret societies promised resistance through coded rituals and oaths, though much of their activity remained talk. Anger poured into slogans, toasts, and small gestures of defiance. Yet within those same spaces, a smaller number began to imagine direct attacks on leaders, moving in their thoughts from political opposition toward personal elimination. Ideas hardened. Lincoln's public calls for a generous peace after Union victory, with malice toward none and charity for all, soothed some hearts while deeply offending those who wanted punishment or racial hierarchy preserved. To certain defeated Confederates, the idea of readmitting states under a government that now recognized black freedom felt intolerable, a future in which their children would live beside people they had owned. In taverns scarred by years of war talk, some men said quietly that removing one man in Washington could change the course of Reconstruction. Hard words spoken over cups and cigar smoke. Such talk from mouths helped make murder seem, to a few, like patriotic sacrifice for formerly enslaved people who reached Union lines or settled in new communities near the Capitol. Lincoln's image carried a different weight, not perfect, but tied to hope for lasting freedom. They named children after him, framed small printed portraits on rough wooden walls, and followed reports of his speeches as closely as they could. In prayer meetings that gathered in simple rooms with plain benches and oil lamps, worshippers thanked God for new liberty and asked protection for leaders who had opened that door. The thought that such a figure might be struck down lingered quietly, another risk inside a violent age. Few dared to predict how near it. By early 1865, when major Confederate armies faltered and surrender approached, celebrations in northern streets coexisted with bitter despair among die-hard supporters of the old order. In some parlors, people spoke of rebuilding in cooperation with Washington, while in others the talk ran hot with claims of betrayal by generals, politicians, and even Providence. Stories circulated about harsh Union commanders, burned barns, and refugees along southern roads, feeding a desire in some hearts to inflict a wound that would echo those losses. Across this unsettled landscape, talk of revenge grew louder, and killing the president was sometimes cast as equal payment. Such words hung in air, daring someone to act. In the Capitol, where telegraph wires hummed and soldiers still patrolled the avenues, Lincoln walked beneath gas lamps, carrying both relief at victory and the weight of unfinished Reconstruction. He spoke in measured tones about healing, about binding up wounds and welcoming states back into the Union, even as enemies listened from balconies, theater boxes, and quiet corners of the city. Around him, the war had turned from open battle to a struggle over memory and power. And within that struggle, men like John Wilkes Booth searched for a dramatic gesture to avenge the South. In that charged air, emancipation was promise and provocation, and hatred searched for a stage. Lincoln's assassination begins, in part, with the life of John Wilkes Booth moving through the divided stages and streets of mid-19th century America. He was born in Maryland in a family of famous actors, surrounded by scripts, costumes, and the shifting light of oil lamps backstage. His father, Junius Brutus Booth, was already a legend, and his older brother Edwin would become one of the finest performers of the age. From childhood, John watched applause wash over crowded rooms and learned that a single figure could command a nation's attention. On stage, Booth learned to project passion with his whole body, lunging and shouting in the sweeping style audiences expected from Shakespearean tragedies. Offstage, he moved with restless energy through hotel lobbies, train cars, and barrooms, charming some and disturbing others. Friends later remembered his handsome face, dark eyes, and quick temper, a man who enjoyed being the center of a circle. As he traveled through southern cities, he absorbed stories of honor and grievance, and he began to see himself primarily as a loyal son of the South. Maryland itself sat on the border between slavery and freedom, with fields, waterways, and rail lines tying it tightly to both North and South. In the countryside, enslaved people worked under the eye of overseers, while nearby towns filled with merchants, lawyers, and small farmers argued over loyalty. Booth grew up hearing strong defenses of slavery and sharp criticism of abolitionists, especially as he spent more time among Southern-leaning families. He embraced white supremacist ideas as part of his identity and carried them with him into every new city where he performed. One turning point for Booth came with John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry and the fierce reaction that followed. Brown's attempt to spark a slave uprising terrified many white Southerners and thrilled some Northerners who hated slavery. When Brown was condemned to die, Booth traveled to Virginia and stood among the troops and spectators gathered to witness the hanging. He watched the abolitionists walk calmly to the gallows and later boasted that he had helped guard the execution, seeing himself as a soldier on the side of Southern order. When the Civil War broke out, Booth stayed on the stage rather than joining the Confederate Army, a choice that created tension between his fiery words and his actual record. He performed across the North under the United States flag, while privately cheering Confederate victories and cursing Federal advances. Some colleagues remembered him praising Southern generals in dressing rooms filled with costumes, mirrors, and open trunks. Others noticed that his talk grew more extreme as battles dragged on, as if he were trying to prove that his heart was braver than his enlistment papers showed. Washington during the war became one of Booth's most important stages, not only for his acting, but for his politics. The city was full of soldiers, clerks, refugees, and secret Southern sympathizers who met in parlors smelling of coal smoke and in taverns crowded with off-duty officers. Some residents passed information to Confederate agents through simple conversations or coded letters. Among these circles were the Surratts, a family that ran a boarding house in the capital and a tavern in Maryland, and whose paths would come dangerously close to Booth's growing plans. Booth's charm and fame allowed him to move easily between respectable drawing rooms and the shadowed corners where frustrated Confederate supporters gathered. In these settings, he met men like Lewis Powell, a former Confederate soldier with a history of violence, and George Atzerodt, a carriage painter familiar with Washington's streets and waterways. He drew the younger David Herald into his circle, a local man comfortable with the countryside south of the city. Through Mary Surratt's boarding house, these figures brushed against one another, sharing meals, stories, and hints of schemes that reached beyond ordinary politics. At first, Booth spoke not of murder, but of kidnapping, a dramatic seizure of the president that he believed could save the Confederacy from total defeat. He imagined capturing Lincoln on a lonely road outside Washington, perhaps as the presidential carriage rolled toward a soldier's hospital or the summer cottage where the family sometimes stayed. The plot, in Booth's mind, would end with Lincoln carried into Confederate territory as a living bargaining piece for prisoner exchanges and recognition. Around tables, scattered with maps and glasses, he tried to convince his companions that such daring could change history. On at least one March afternoon in 1865, Booth and several conspirators waited along a Maryland road for Lincoln's carriage, horses ready and nerves tight. They had heard that the president would be traveling to see a play or visit wounded soldiers, and they believed that a small escort could be overpowered. The dust, the fence lines, and the bare early spring trees formed the backdrop for their long, tense wait. Then word reached them that Lincoln had changed his plans, and the carriage never came, leaving their elaborate scheme hanging in empty air. Each failure chipped at Booth's standing among his small band as days passed, and nothing came of the bold words he had poured into their ears. Some conspirators drifted back toward ordinary work, uneasy about the risk and unsure whether the Confederacy could still be saved. Others questioned whether any plan that depended so much on one unpredictable actor could succeed. Booth responded by speaking even more intensely, pacing floors in rented rooms and sketching new schemes on scraps of paper, his mind racing faster than events would allow. In Maryland's countryside, Booth also cultivated connections that would later help him flee, including his acquaintance with Dr. Samuel Mudd. Mudd was a country physician and slaveholder who shared some Southern sympathies and had met Booth when the actor was seeking land investments. On quiet visits to the doctor's farm, conversations touched on politics, horses, and possible routes through the back roads that threaded tobacco fields and small villages. Those meetings did not yet carry the weight they would gain, but they helped Booth picture a path away from Washington after any desperate act. When General Lee surrendered to General Grant at Appomattox, crowds in Washington poured into streets hung with flags and bright with bonfires. But Booth felt only rage and despair. He moved among the celebrating throngs like a man walking against the current of a river, hearing cheers where he expected mourning. For him, the surrender meant not simply military defeat, but the collapse of a world built on white dominance and Southern pride. In his mind, someone had to pay for that collapse, and he fixed on Lincoln as the central symbol of his loss. A few nights later, Booth stood in the crowd outside the White House while Lincoln spoke from an upstairs window to citizens gathered on the lawn. The president's voice carried over the gas-lit grounds as he talked about Reconstruction and hinted that some black men, especially soldiers and educated citizens, should receive the right to vote. For many listeners, the idea seemed cautious and limited, a small step into an uncertain future. For Booth, already consumed by racism and wounded pride, those words felt like a final insult that demanded violent answer. In the days that followed, Booth's thoughts turned from kidnapping toward killing, from bargaining with a captured president to striking at the Union government's head. He told his associates that by eliminating Lincoln, Vice President Andrew Johnson, and Secretary of State William Seward on the same night, they could throw Washington into chaos and give the Confederacy a chance to rise again. The plan grew in his mind like a dark script. Each conspirator assigned a role and a target. Booth reserved for himself the part he saw as most grand, the attack on Lincoln in a public place. Ford's Theatre offered Booth exactly the sort of public place he wanted, a setting he knew as well as any home. The brick building on 10th Street, with its arched windows and warm gaslights, had welcomed him as a performer and guest many times. He understood the layout of the stage, the doors, and the boxes, and he knew how audiences and staff moved during an evening show. When he learned that Lincoln planned to attend a comedy there on Good Friday, he recognized the opportunity he had been waiting for. On the day of the planned attack, Booth moved through Washington with outward calm and inward urgency, completing last details like an actor checking props before a performance. He visited a stable to arrange for a swift horse, walked the familiar sidewalks near Ford's Theatre, and met with several conspirators to repeat their grim assignments. Lewis Powell was to strike at Secretary Seward in his home, while Atzerodt was supposed to target Vice President Johnson in a nearby hotel. Booth rode briefly into the Maryland countryside to contact Mary Surratt and secure items he believed he would need after his escape. By late afternoon and early evening, Booth's path and Lincoln's evening plans were slowly bending toward the same brick theater on 10th Street. Inside, Ford's stagehands tested lamps, checked scenery, and swept sawdust from the floor while actors rehearsed lines for an audience eager to laugh after long years of war. Outside, families and soldiers made their way along the sidewalk, unaware that one familiar actor was walking past storefronts with a hidden weapon and a fixed determination. Booth stopped in nearby saloons, spoke lightly with acquaintances, and then returned to the theater with the ease of a man who belonged there. As the sun faded and gas lights glowed against the night, the plot that had grown from his hatred, his sense of drama, and his belief in violent redemption settled into place, ready to collide with the quiet hope Lincoln carried into the balcony box on that warm April night. In the story of Lincoln's assassination, the central moment comes on Good Friday evening as President Lincoln prepares to visit Ford's Theatre. Outside, Washington glows with flags and lanterns, the city breathing cautious relief after war. Inside the White House, the day's final decisions settle like dust upon the desks. During the afternoon, Lincoln meets with members of his cabinet, speaking calmly about Reconstruction and distant frontiers. Some notice how light his step seems, how his lined face softens when the talk turns toward peace. He jokes softly, folds messages in his long fingers, and seems for a moment lighter. In the early evening, he rides through the city with Mary, sharing stories about their children and the future. He speaks of dreams that feel like omens, yet laughs them away, not wishing to darken the night. Carriage wheels rattle over stones as passers-by lift hats, watching the familiar figure. Tonight, they have accepted an invitation to Ford's Theatre to see a popular comedy titled Our American Cousin. The idea of an evening among laughter feels like a small gift after so many telegrams about death. Mary hopes the outing will ease weariness and show the public that peace nears. Their usual companions for such evenings would have included their son or close allies, yet arrangements shift with the day. General Grant declines the invitation, choosing to travel instead, and so Major Henry Rathbone and Clara Harris are asked along. They dress, knowing the president will make the night special. As dusk deepens, crowds gather outside Ford's Theatre, its brick front brightened by gas lamps and posted notices. Vendors move along the busy sidewalk, selling peanuts and candy, while soldiers in uniform join civilians at the doors. Inside, ushers prepare programs and straighten chairs as the orchestra tunes softly nearby. John Wilkes Booth moves through familiar hallways and backstage spaces, greeting stagehands and actors with practiced ease. To them, he is a well-known performer, intense yet charming, who has shared this stage many nights before. They do not see the small tools he carries or the hard purpose inside. When curtain time nears, the presidential party has not yet arrived, and a ripple of disappointment moves through the crowd. Many had hoped to see Lincoln in person, to tell children and grandchildren they once watched him from across the room. Still, the play begins, and laughter rises beneath ceiling. Partway into the performance, the president's carriage finally pulls up, wheels crunching against the street outside the theater. Lincoln steps out with Mary, Rathbone, and Clara, climbing the narrow stairs as people near the entrance begin to cheer. Inside, the orchestra plays as the audience stands to welcome him warmly. The presidential party moves along a carpeted corridor to the decorated box above the audience on the right. Inside, workers have arranged a rocking chair, additional seats, and flags draped along the railing, one hanging in gentle folds. From this height, the stage glows, and the faces below blur together. A policeman named John Parker is supposed to guard the entrance to the presidential box, a simple wooden chair marking his post. He watches part of the play, then drifts away toward the lobby and a nearby tavern, leaving the corridor unguarded. No one imagines how that absence will become. On stage, actors deliver quick lines and broad gestures that pull laughter from the crowd, easing shoulders and tired faces. Lincoln leans back in his rocking chair, smiling at the jokes, his long legs stretched comfortably before him. Mary sits beside him, glad to see laughter reach his face again. Elsewhere in the building, Booth prepares the path he will walk, studying doors and walls with a craftsman's eye. He discovers that the corridor door to the box can be blocked by bracing a wooden bar against the frame and wall. He quietly widens a peephole to watch inside later. Booth carries a small, single-shot pistol and a sharp knife, both easily hidden beneath his tailored clothes. To him, these objects feel like props in a grand tragedy, instruments through which he imagines claiming sudden glory. He repeats Shakespeare under his breath and pictures posters praising his daring someday. As the evening deepens toward 10 o'clock, the play reaches scenes the audience knows for their broadest laughter. Booth has studied the script and chosen a moment when a famous joke will draw every eye and ear to the stage. He plans to fire when laughter swells, hiding sound inside. Near the back of the theater, Booth leaves his horse with a young stagehand, asking him to hold it ready. He moves through the alley door and into familiar backstage shadows, nodding to those who still greet him as a friend. No one stops him as he climbs toward corridor. At the top, he slips the wooden bar within reach and quietly tests how it will brace the outer door. Through the widened peephole, he can see the back of Lincoln's head, Mary beside him, and their companions leaning close. The peaceful scene inside feels to Booth like an insult. On stage below, the actors keep the story moving, trading lines in a pattern they have repeated many times. The audience leans forward with each comic misunderstanding, ready for the burst of laughter that always comes at a certain point. Up in the box, Lincoln relaxes, pleased to see laughter. Booth waits for a burst of applause to cover his approach, then steps into the corridor and toward the unguarded door. He slips inside the inner door of the box, closing it behind him, and for a moment, Rathbone assumes he is staff. Booth murmurs politely, then moves toward chair. At the chosen line, when the audience explodes with laughter, Booth steps close behind Lincoln and raises the pistol. The report is sharp but partly swallowed by the noise, a single violent crack within the rolling sound of amusement. Lincoln's head tilts forward and some nearby think he has fainted. Rathbone reacts quickly, rising from his seat to grapple with Booth, who turns and slashes at him with the knife. The blow tears into Rathbone's arm and chest, and blood begins to soak his evening clothes. Booth leaps to the rail, cries out briefly, and jumps toward the stage below. He lands badly, striking the stage and injuring his leg, then rises with a visible stagger as actors and audience stare. Brandishing the knife, he shouts Latin words about empire and fate, then limps across the stage toward the rear exit. Some believe at first it is part of performance. In the presidential box, Mary realizes the truth before most others, crying out and clutching her husband's shoulders as he slumps. Rathbone, bleeding heavily, calls for help while Clara Harris attempts to calm Mary and signal the shocked audience below. Cries of murder ring through the theater as people scatter. On the main floor, a young army surgeon named Charles Leal pushes his way through the crowd toward the stairs. He reaches the presidential box after identifying himself, climbing over chairs and squeezing past frightened theatergoers who make room. Inside, he finds Lincoln unconscious, breathing shallowly, with Mary still calling. Leal quickly examines the president's chest and arms, searching for the cause, then notices a small wound behind the left ear. He realizes that the bullet has entered the skull and that there is little chance of full recovery in this age. Still, he resolves to keep Lincoln alive, comfortable. On stage, the actors have stopped the performance entirely, standing near the footlights as they try to understand the uproar. One of them steps forward to tell the bewildered audience that the president has been shot and asks them to leave calmly. Many crowd toward doors or crane their necks. The interior of Ford's Theatre, only minutes before, filled with easy laughter, now holds pockets of panic, prayer, and stunned silence. Soldiers rush into the aisles, their boots thudding on wooden steps as they search for the assassin and try to restore order. The smell of gas and powder hangs. Inside the box, Leal and other helpers decide that Lincoln cannot survive a jolting carriage ride back to the White House. They choose instead to carry him from the theater, searching for a nearby house where he can rest quietly. Carefully, they lift his body and move through the doorway. The small group bears Lincoln down the steep stairs, his long frame supported by several men who struggle to keep balance. Mary follows close behind, supported by Clara, her cries cutting through the murmurs as spectators draw back to make space. Some reach to touch his sleeve as he passes. Outside, the night air feels cooler and carries the sounds of distant celebration that have not yet fully died away. A man across the street, the tailor William Petersen, or one of his boarders, calls out that they should bring Lincoln there. The brick townhouse stands opposite, its doorway focus. The men carry Lincoln across the uneven street and through the doorway into Petersen's narrow hallway. Brushing past astonished residents, rooms open on either side, some too small, some already occupied, until they choose a back bedroom with a simple bed. There they lay him diagonally, his height exceeding bed. Back at Ford's Theatre, soldiers clear the remaining crowd and search every corner, though Booth has already vanished into the dark streets. A guard now stands at the entrance of the once welcoming box, watching over scattered belongings and the blood-stained floor. The lights remain, but their meaning has changed. In the cramped room across the street, doctors and friends gather around the wounded president as the city learns the news. Good Friday in Washington, which began with hope and bright banners, settles now into a night of whispered prayers. The theater quiets, the street darkens, and a vigil begins. Lincoln's assassination moves from the bright noise of Ford's Theatre to the close rooms of the Petersen House on 10th Street, where the long night of April 14th into April 15th, 1865, stretches slow and heavy over Washington, breath by breath. Inside, time seems to loosen and wander. Men supporting the president's limp body shuffle through the narrow front hall, boots scraping across worn floorboards as residents crowd doorways in their nightclothes. Astonished at the sight, they finally choose a back bedroom with plain wallpaper and a narrow bed pushed against the wall beneath a single window there. The bed is too short, so they lay Lincoln diagonally, his stockinged feet against one post, his head resting near the other corner. Someone removes his boots and cuts away his shirt collar, while another folds a coat into a cushion to steady his shoulders. The room fills with whispering. Army Surgeon Charles Leal bends over the still form, his fingers searching for a pulse at the neck, then at the wrist. He opens an eye, notes the unresponsive gaze, and gently presses along the chest, at first wondering if the wound lies hidden there. Then he sees the blood. Leal finds the small opening behind the left ear where the bullet entered, its edges blackened, the hair around it damp with blood. He realizes that the shot has pierced the brain, and that in this time no surgery can reach it without certain death. His work becomes comfort alone. Mary sits nearby at first, her dress spattered with her fiancé Rathbone's blood, eyes wide as she watches the doctors bend over her husband. She cries his name, asking he is conscious, begging someone to say, "This is faintness, not mortal harm," her voice rising and falling in the air. At last, one of the physicians and several friends gently guide Mary from the bedside. fearing her grief will disturb the president's fragile breathing. She is taken to the front parlor, a modest room with chairs along the walls and a small table where she paces, cries, and waits alone. In the back bedroom, doctors lower the gaslight to keep the air from overheating and place a candle where its soft glow touches the bedclothes. A clock ticks on a nearby mantel, its rhythm strangely loud between quiet words, while outside carriages rattle past and then stop altogether before dawn. On 10th Street, soldiers begin to form a guard line, their bayonets catching the lamplight as they hold back the growing crowd of neighbors and late-night passers-by. Whispers move along the line that the president is inside and dying, and yet some ask whether this is only another rumor. Messengers race from the theater and the house toward larger buildings, their footsteps slapping stone as they deliver hurried notes to cabinet members, generals, and the vice president's lodgings. Confusion travels with them, because rumors describe attacks on other officials, and no one yet knows how far the conspiracy extends. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton arrives at the Petersen House with a tight jaw and quick stride, his mind already turning from shock toward questions and orders. He moves past the soldiers into the bedroom, takes in the scene at a glance, positions himself where he can observe and direct. Almost at once, Stanton starts asking who saw what at the theater, sending officers to collect statements from actors, stagehands, nearby patrons, and the wounded Major Rathbone. He dictates orders from the sick room and hallway, using tables and chairs, turning the boarding house into an urgent center of government for decisions. The doctors continue their careful work, loosening Lincoln's clothing, keeping his airway clear, and adjusting his position so breathing can remain as easy as possible. They check his pulse again and again, watching it weaken and then strengthen slightly, recording each change in notebooks that tremble in their tired hands. Lincoln's breathing is heavy and irregular, a series of deep sighs that seem at times to stop, causing the room to hold its own collective breath. He never regains consciousness, though then his face tightens or his limbs move, motions that friends read hopefully, but doctors see as fading reflex. Around the walls of the bedroom and in the hallway, officials sit or stand in stiff chairs, their faces drawn, their clothing rumpled from long hours. Some weep quietly, others bow their heads, and a few simply stare at the floorboards as though looking there for guidance about the future. From time to time, Mary is brought back into the bedroom, supported by friends, to sit beside the bed and hold her husband's hand as best she can. Her sobs fill the space, and more than one officer has to turn away, eyes wet, before she is led out again. Robert Lincoln arrives at the house after midnight, summoned from his own lodgings, and passes through the crowded hallway with a pale, shocked expression. He stands by the foot of the bed, looking at his father's still face, then steps aside to let the doctors continue their work through night. Clergymen are called, and at different moments, Episcopal and other ministers stand near the bed, offering quiet prayers that thread through the heavier sound of breathing and muffled footsteps. Some accounts remember a short hymn, others a few verses. But in every memory, the feeling is one of hushed helplessness. Across the city, telegraph operators tap out messages describing the shooting at Ford's Theatre, and the president's condition, sending brief, urgent phrases racing along wires to distant towns. In offices and depots, editors and clerks read the news, struggle to grasp it, and prepare pages that hope he lives tomorrow. Outside the Petersen House, the crowd thickens until the street becomes a living corridor of worry, filled with soldiers, freed people, clerks, nurses, and curious visitors. Some stand in prayer, some murmur conversation, and others fix their eyes on the closed doorway, listening for change in the voices inside there. Elsewhere in Washington, church bells ring in uncertain patterns as ministers awaken congregants, while saloons and hotels buzz with rumors that leap faster than facts can follow. Troops are ordered to guard bridges and buildings. Cavalry patrols clatter along avenues, and the capital feels like a place under occupation already. Inside the Petersen House, Stanton and others speak in low tones about the scale of the plot, unsure whether more attacks might follow before morning comes. They worry about the safety of Vice President Andrew Johnson and officials, and about how the government will stand if Lincoln dies this night. Meanwhile, officers begin organizing the hunt for Booth and his accomplices, questioning witnesses from the theater and sending riders toward bridges, stables, and suspected safe houses. Descriptions of the assassin spread quickly, naming his height, his profession as an actor, his injured leg, and his route into the Maryland countryside. Hour after hour, the room's small clock marks the passing time, its hands creeping from midnight toward dawn as the watchers grow more exhausted and still. Doctors occasionally note the minute of a change, recording when the pulse weakens further, when breathing pauses longer, as though numbers might offer control. Toward dawn, the faint blue of early light touches the window pane behind the bed, though the gas flame still burns, and the room remains enclosed. Outside, birds begin a chorus above the muttering crowd, while inside, Mary is once more brought to the bedside, clutching a handkerchief in trembling fingers. At last, as the hour approaches 7 on the morning of April 15th, the breathing grows shallower and more spaced, until even the doctors sense the nearness of the end. Witnesses see a final deep breath, and at about 7:22 that morning, the president's life quietly slips away. Silence holds the room for a moment. Then Stanton steps forward, looks at the still face, and speaks the words that different witnesses remember slightly differently. Some recall that he says now he belongs to the ages, others now he belongs to the angels, but all remember a reverent hush. Men in the room remove their hats, some fall to their knees beside the bed, and others turn away to cover their faces. For a few minutes, there is no official business, only the sound of quiet sobbing and the soft creak of someone shifting weight on the floorboards nearby. Soon Stanton straightens, wipes his eyes, and begins again to give orders, telling officers to secure the capital and continue the search for Booth without delay. He sends word to Andrew Johnson, who becomes president that morning, and to other leaders, reminding them government must show steadiness despite the blow. The doctors and attendants now turn to caring for the body, washing blood from the face and hair, closing the eyes, and arranging the limbs with simple respect. They wrap the remains in cloth and place them in a coffin, since further preparations will take place at the White House. When the time comes to move the body, soldiers and attendants carry the coffin carefully back through the narrow hallway and out into the morning light on 10th Street. The crowd falls silent as it passes, hats lowered, many people weeping now that the rumor has hardened into undeniable fact. Inside the Petersen House, pillows, sheets, and small pieces of furniture that touched the night's events remain behind, suddenly transformed in the minds of witnesses into quiet relics of history. Neighbors move through the rooms in a daze, touching door frames and chairs, wondering how the townhouse became House of Mourning. By mid-morning, the vigil has ended, the body has gone, and yet the quiet little house on 10th Street holds the imprint of every whispered word. The long night after the shooting has closed, leaving a day when the United States must face loss, anger, and the work of mourning. Lincoln's assassination is followed by a shock that moves through Washington on April 15th, 1865, then races outward along rails and humming telegraph wires toward corners of the Union. In the capital, soldiers, clerks, and nurses wake to rumors that the president has been murdered in a theater. At first, the news feels slippery. One more wild story in a city that has lived on rumor through 4 long years of war. Men stumble from boarding house rooms. Women lean from upstairs windows, and questions fly along the muddy street outside the little brick house on 10th that night. Inside the War Department telegraph office, operators who spent the war sending casualty lists now sit straighter as urgent messages arrive from 10th Street. They learn the president has been shot, is unconscious, may already be dying, and that cavalry must ride at once after the fleeing assassin into Maryland. Near the Petersen House doorway, lamplight spills across uniforms, shawls, and worried faces as more people arrive, and the line thickens. A guard tries to keep order, repeating that the president is gravely hurt, not yet gone, while behind him muffled voices drift down the steep stairway and hall inside. Telegraph keys chatter through the small hours, sending the story of Lincoln's assassination from Washington to Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, and far beyond. Short-clipped words carry a heavy truth, describing a shot in a theater box, a dying president, and officials uncertain how wide the conspiracy runs that night. In northern newspaper offices, copy editors and typesetters gather under gas lamps as the first bulletins arrive on thin strips of paper. They read and reread the lines, trying to decide whether to wake their printers, whether to ring bells, whether this unbelievable message is somehow a cruel hoax tonight. Soon the news slips beyond offices into darkened streets, carried by newsboys pounding on doors and shouting half-formed headlines. In New York, people peer from windows of tall brick buildings, tie dressing gowns, and hurry outside, clustering around lampposts, while someone reads the dispatch aloud in a shaking voice. In small towns, the telegraph operator might be the first to know, sitting alone in a wooden office where the ticking suddenly changes. He copies the message carefully, walks across a quiet square to wake the minister or the mayor, and together they ring the church bell before sunrise slowly. For many Black Americans, especially those newly freed or living in northern cities, the first reports land like a blow. Some hold newspaper scraps close to lamps reading the words again and again, unwilling to accept that the man they call Father Abraham might be dying while victory bells echo. In homes that already carry the quiet of grief for Union dead, the news about Lincoln spreads along kitchen tables and across porches. Mothers who kept his portrait beside the image of a fallen son now touch both frames, feeling that the war has reached once more into their house. Among former Confederates, the reaction is more tangled, mixing sorrow, resentment, relief, and fear about what comes next. Some people in southern towns say quietly that Lincoln might have been a better friend in peace than Congress will be, while others mutter that a hated enemy has been struck down. In one southern city, newly freed black people gather outside a small church, praying for Lincoln's life as they hear scattered details about the shooting. Nearby, in another quarter of the same town, white neighbors gather in a parlor and speak of shifting fortunes, unsure whether to grieve or celebrate. Back in Washington, as dawn spreads pale light along Pennsylvania Avenue, the city's sound slowly changes from scattered shouts to a low, continuous murmur. Church bells that rang in celebration now toll, one measured strike after another, sending vibrations through neighborhoods where black crepe will hang from doorways and windows. At the White House, officials move quickly through corridors that still hold the weariness of wartime meetings, hanging black fabric along doorways and windows. Servants whisper to each other as they polish doorknobs, straighten carpets, and prepare rooms that will soon receive crowds of mourners, dignitaries, and curious citizens there. In cabinet members' homes, messengers knock with urgent hands, rousing men who hours earlier sat at Lincoln's side during meetings about Reconstruction. They dress hurriedly, tie cravats with shaking fingers, and return to the War Department, where Stanton has turned the Telegraph office into a center of command and mourning. Andrew Johnson, the vice president who had gone to bed an unknown figure to most Americans, wakes to learn that he is now president. In a private room at the Kirkwood House Hotel, he composes himself, then later takes the oath of office while the nation is still reeling inside. On Washington streets, residents drift toward the public buildings that have defined the war years, unsure where else to place their sorrow. Freed people in coats and simple dresses walk beside soldiers, nurses, and clerks, all moving toward the executive mansion or the Capitol, as if nearness might steady them. Inside the telegraph offices across the Union, operators who once tapped out casualty figures for Antietam and Gettysburg now transmit funeral language. They copy Stanton's official notices, which describe the president's death at 7:22 in the morning, and they feel the distance between their desks and history narrow today. Children notice adults' changed voices before they understand the words, watching parents move more slowly through chores and conversations. In city streets, noisy carts roll with unusual quiet as drivers speak in low tones, and in farmyards, men pause before hitching horses, listening for the bells they know are coming. Some who fought Lincoln fiercely in politics wake to the news and feel arguments fall away, at least for a moment. A newspaper editor who once printed cartoons now writes a front page framed in black lines, calling the assassination a crime against the United States. not only one party. Even in pockets of the defeated Confederacy, where many still curse Lincoln's name, thoughtful voices warn that killing him will bring harsher treatment. A storekeeper in Richmond tells neighbors that the dead cannot pardon anyone, that radicals in Congress will now push their hard measures with less restraint or mercy. Yet there are also rooms where the mood is unguardedly cruel, where men toast Booth's name and speak of him as a hero. These gatherings in back rooms of taverns or private parlors do not yet see themselves as standing near treason's edge, only as nursing resentment after bitter defeat. Federal officials understand that such bitterness could flare into riots or reprisals, so they position troops to protect vulnerable neighborhoods. In Washington and other cities, soldiers stand near black churches and meeting halls, watch over bridges and depots, and try to ensure that grief does not twist into wider violence. As the day wears on, impromptu gatherings form wherever people feel a need to stand together in silence. In one northern city, office clerks and laborers line a main street at noon, heads uncovered, while a minister offers a brief prayer and a military band plays a slow, solemn hymn. Across the Atlantic, diplomats and newspaper correspondents cable home, describing both the assassination and the strange quiet filling Washington's avenues. In London, Paris, and other capitals, officials who once doubted Lincoln's strength now send condolences, recognizing that his death removes a steadying presence just as the Union emerges from war. Far from the capital, in camps where the war's end has not yet fully reached, soldiers read copies of the telegram tacked to trees or posted outside tents. Some stare at the words as if they belong to an enemy hoax, then fold the paper and tuck it into pockets. In Washington's growing black neighborhoods, people gather in open lots and simple meeting halls to share the news and their fears. Some worry that Lincoln's death will embolden those who hate emancipation, that the promises of freedom and land will crumble now that the president who announced them is gone. Inside the White House, Mary Lincoln remains largely out of public view, her grief overwhelming in rooms that still hold echoes of children's laughter and wartime meetings. Servants hear her cries through closed doors, and some remember the sight of the black-clad figure who has lost husband and sons. When Lincoln's body is brought back to the executive mansion and placed in the East Room, people file past in heavy, slow lines. Candles and gaslights cast a soft glow on black drapery, flowers, and the still features that were once so familiar in crowded receptions and cabinet meetings there. Newspapers struggle to balance description with respect, filling columns with details about the long night at the Petersen House, the search for Booth, and plans for Mourning. Many front pages are framed in black borders, while editorial writers reach for language of martyrdom, sacrifice, and national sin, mixed with hope. From the War Department, Stanton sends messages announcing a national day of mourning, asking communities to close businesses and gather in churches. Pastors, priests, and rabbis across the country begin to plan services, choosing passages that speak of sorrow, leadership, and the hope that a wounded nation can heal again. In a quiet farmhouse miles from any city, a family gathers in their main room as the father reads aloud from a local paper. The clock ticks a child's toy lies forgotten on the floor, and for a few minutes, their small house feels connected to the larger, grieving republic. So the first full day after Lincoln's assassination unfolds in a mixture of stunned quiet and hurried motion, of bells, telegrams, prayers, and whispered plans. While millions absorb the news and try to imagine life without him, riders and detectives follow Booth's trail into the countryside, carrying the nation's anger. Lincoln's assassination is followed on the ground in Washington and across the Maryland countryside by a manhunt that begins before the president has even died. Within minutes of the shooting, cavalry troopers receive urgent orders, detectives scramble for clues, and guard posts at bridges and depots wake fully to their task. The nation will move through a long season of grief. But this night belongs to swift decisions, bright lamp flames, and the sound of hooves on dirt. On the stage at Ford's Theatre and in the streets nearby, people shout out fragments of what they have seen, offering names, directions, and impressions through their shock. Investigators try to gather these pieces into a clear path. Yet for the moment, the picture is blurred by fear, confusion, and the pace of events. They know the shooter is John Wilkes Booth, an actor, and that he left by the rear door. Out in the cool April air, Booth limps away from 10th Street and meets the young David Herald near a prearranged spot. The city behind them is turning into a ring of soldiers and alarms. Yet the streets close by still hold patches of ordinary night. They ride through those pockets of quiet, hooves striking stone and dirt, heading toward the Navy Yard Bridge that spans the Anacostia River. Curfew rules say that no one should cross that bridge so late without proper cause, and soldiers watch the approach with wary eyes. Booth arrives first and gives his name openly, saying he is traveling home to the Maryland countryside, a familiar story from actors on tour. The guard, unaware of what has happened at Ford's Theatre, lets him pass, then allows Herald across not long afterward. Behind them, Lewis Powell's assault on Secretary Seward adds fresh terror to the night. As word of Lincoln's assassination spreads through Washington in the early hours, the city's bridges and roads close like tightening cords. Orders go out to block traffic, question late travelers, and watch for any man who matches the description of the fleeing actor. It is one of history's small cruelties that Booth and Herald have already slipped past the first bridge before these commands arrive. At the same time, George Atzerodt, assigned to kill Vice President Johnson, loses his nerve and spends the night drinking in a hotel bar. His failure will later help investigators link him to the plot, as witnesses recall his strange questions about Johnson and his agitated wandering. Inside the War Department, Stanton and his staff turn confusion into lists and actions, writing names of suspects and sending cavalry units into the dark. They send riders in all directions and telegraph nearby Maryland towns and villages. Beyond the bridge, Booth and Herald ride into the Maryland night, following narrow roads that wind between fields and small clusters of trees. The air smells of damp earth and early spring growth, a sharp contrast to the crowded theater they have left behind. They stop at Surrattsville, where Mary Surratt's roadside tavern serves as a known point for Confederate sympathizers moving through the countryside. Earlier that day, She had brought a package there at Booth's request, and now the fugitives collect field glasses and a carbine left in hiding. The stop is brief, yet it will later weigh heavily in courtrooms, where witnesses trace her movements and his in careful detail. From there, they press on to the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd, moving through deeper darkness as lamps go out in scattered farmhouses. Booth's injured leg throbs with each step, and he leans on Harold's support and courage. In the grey light before dawn, Booth and Harold reach the Mudd farm, a modest house surrounded by fields and a few outbuildings. They knock and call the doctor from his bed, presenting Booth as a traveller who has injured his leg in a riding accident. Inside the lamplit room, Mudd sets the broken bone, fits a splint, and provides a crutch, while the patient grits his teeth against the pain. Whether Mudd recognizes Booth at once or only later will become a question that echoes through his trial and the years after. He had met the actor before and had heard talk of buying land together, so the face on the bed is not that of a stranger. Booth and Harold remain for several hours and perhaps into the next day, resting, gathering strength, and planning their continued flight southward. Meanwhile, the widening search is drawing closer to Mudd. Soon after the visit, news of Lincoln's assassination reaches the Maryland countryside, carried by riders and distant telegraph reports that filter into crossroads towns. At Bryantown, a nearby village, soldiers gather information from residents, and Dr. Mudd rides in, speaking with officers and neighbors in the busy street. His decision not to immediately reveal that he has treated a man with a broken leg will later appear damning to investigators and jurors. Cavalry eventually visits the farm, questioning Mudd and searching for signs of the fugitives. But by then, Booth and Harold have moved into denser cover. Guided by local Confederate sympathizers, they slip into the tangled brush and wetlands of the region sometimes called the Zekiah Swamp and Pine Thicket. There, hidden among trees and undergrowth, they spend several days in rough concealment, eating simple food and listening for distant sounds of pursuit. Thomas Jones aids them in hiding. Thomas Jones knows both the marshy ground and the shifting currents of the nearby Potomac, knowledge that makes him valuable to the men in hiding. He brings them food, newspapers, and news of the hunt, walking carefully so that hoofprints and footprints do not betray his path to approaching patrols. In the thicket, Booth reads reports that describe him as a cowardly murderer, not the heroic avenger he imagined, and his mood grows darker. Harold worries about every broken twig and distant shout, while rain, insects, and the ache of waiting wear on both men in their damp shelter. Jones understands that movement too soon would be fatal, so he urges patience until the first heat of the search begins to relax. At last, when he judges that troops have shifted their focus, he helps Booth and Harold reach a small boat under cover of night. They push off downstream. The Potomac at night is a wide, deceptive stretch, and Booth and Harold do not know its every shoal and current. Their first attempt to cross leaves them lost among inlets and marshes on the Maryland side, again, cold, wet, and frustrated at the wasted risk. They hide another day in isolated cover, then try again under Jones's guidance, rowing carefully across the dark water toward the Virginia shore. This time, they land on the far bank, climb from the boat, and step into a countryside that has just seen the collapse of the Confederacy. Moving through King George County and beyond, they rely on a loose chain of Southern sympathizers who still feel loyalty to the lost cause. At one house, they find shelter and food. At another, wary glances as Virginians weigh the risk of helping famous fugitives whose names are filling papers. New guides appear on horseback. The young men on horseback include former Confederate soldiers who now shuttle between scattered homes and river landings, unsure how to rebuild their own lives. Among them are men like Willie Jett, who listens as Booth claims to be a wounded officer seeking refuge and passage farther south. They help the pair cross the Rappahannock River by ferry to the little town of Port Royal, where white clapboard houses line a quiet road. There Booth finds lodging at the farm of Richard Garrett, presenting himself as a weary soldier who needs a place to rest for a short while. The Garrett family takes him in, offering a bed on the porch or in a room, but their trust begins to fray as days pass and news travels. They hear that the president's killer is at large, that a reward has been offered, and that patrols are working along the roads. While Booth rests uneasily at the Garrett farm, the manhunt that began in Washington stretches deeper into Maryland and Virginia under determined leadership. Detectives like Luther Baker and Everton Conger work with Lieutenant Edward Doherty and other officers, piecing together reports from farms, ferries, taverns, and crossroads. They follow the trail from Ford's Theatre to Mary Surratt's boarding house, then to her tavern at Surrattsville, to Dr. Mudd's farm, and beyond. Everywhere they go, they record testimony about times, words, horses, and strangers, turning kitchen tables and parlor chairs into places of quiet interrogation. In Virginia, they capture Willie Jett and question him until he admits that the wounded stranger he helped has taken shelter at the Garrett farm. Late on April 25th, a column of Union cavalry rides toward that farm under dark skies, hooves beating a steady pattern on the road. They move in quietly around the farmyard. At the Garrett place, Union soldiers discover that Booth and Harold are hiding in a tobacco barn near the house. They quietly position men around the building and call for the occupants to surrender, promising protection if they emerge unarmed. Harold, hearing the number of voices and seeing no path out, chooses to leave Booth behind and gives himself up. Booth refuses, declaring that he will not be taken alive, and shouts defiance through the wooden walls into the night air. After a long standoff, the officers decide to set part of the barn afire, hoping the flames will force him out into the open. Light spills through the cracks, revealing a limping figure with a crutch and gun moving inside a growing frame of smoke and sparks. A single shot from Sergeant Boston Corbett wounds Booth badly, and by sunrise he is dead, leaving questions for courts and country. In the story of Lincoln's assassination, attention shifts from the manhunt in Maryland and Virginia into the crowded courtrooms and prison yards where the United States seeks judgment and punishment. Within days of the shooting and Booth's death in the burning barn, officials decide that the surviving suspects will face a military commission rather than a civilian jury. To Stanton and many others in the War Department, the assassination seems less like one man's crime and more like an extension of war by secret means. A military court feels faster, safer, and more controllable at a moment when people fear that hidden enemies still move through the capital streets. On a small island in the Potomac called the Washington Arsenal, an old brick penitentiary stands behind high walls and guarded gates. It is here that the principal prisoners are held, their cells narrow and their windows covered to prevent signals or curious glances. Masks and fabric hoods are used on some of the men, an extreme measure born from fear and a desire to break communication. Within these walls sit Lewis Powell, George Atzerodt, David Herold, Dr. Samuel Mudd, Mary Surratt, and several others accused of helping or sheltering the conspirators. The decision to use a military commission shapes every part of what follows, from the way evidence is gathered to the fate of those on trial. 9 officers sit as judges, all of them men who wore Union blue during the war and who now carry memories of battlefield loss. To many citizens, this panel seems less likely than a civilian jury to show mercy toward anyone tied to the plot. To others, the court's composition feels right for an act they see as part of Confederate warfare, not ordinary crime. Outside the prison, the public studies every scrap of news about the suspects, forming judgments long before testimony begins. Newspapers print sketches of Mary Surratt in her dark bonnet, of Powell's strong features, of Atzerott's uneasy gaze, of Herold's youth. Many are fascinated that a woman, a boarding house keeper with a church-going reputation, is among those accused. In barbershops, parlor rooms, and factory yards, people argue over whether Mary Surratt is mastermind, victim, or convenient symbol of hidden Southern networks. When the trial opens in May, the courtroom at the Arsenal is arranged with rows of chairs for spectators, tables for counsel, and a long bench for the officers. The prisoners are brought in under heavy guard, some wearing irons, some gaunt from weeks of poor sleep and anxious waiting in their cells. Reporters take their places, sharpening pencils and preparing to send each day's testimony back to readers hungry for detail and drama. In this room, the government hopes to prove not only who helped Booth, but also how far the conspiracy reached beyond him. Testimony begins with witnesses from Ford's Theatre, who describe Booth's movements on the day of the crime and the scene inside the presidential box. Stagehands recall his calm before the performance and his familiarity with corners of the building where he once acted. Others recount how he leapt to the stage after the shot, shouted his words, and limped from sight as the crowd tried to grasp what had happened. These accounts fix Booth firmly as the assassin and frame the rest of the trial as a search for his helpers and enablers. Soon, attention turns to the nights and days leading up to the murder, with witnesses placing conspirators together in boarding houses, taverns, and country roads. Employees from Mary Surratt's house describe the flow of visitors, the closed-door conversations, and Booth's frequent presence. At Surrattsville, the tavern keeper and his family recall carbines hidden in the walls and packages delivered on the day of the attack. Piece by piece, the prosecution builds an image of a web that held Booth up and smoothed his way as he moved toward that theatre box. For Lewis Powell, The evidence includes the brutal attack on Secretary Seward in his own home on the very same night. Witnesses describe how Powell forced his way into the sick room, injured several people, and left Seward bleeding on bedclothes and pillows. When he was arrested later, Powell still carried weapons and gave confused, contradictory statements that did little to help his case. Few doubt that he played a direct part in the wider plot, even if Booth never told him every detail. George Atzerodt appears less dangerous on paper, a carriage painter and boatman who spent the crucial hours drinking instead of striking at Andrew Johnson. Yet witnesses recall his talk of killing the vice president and his earlier work carrying messages across the Potomac for Confederate agents. The prosecution argues that Atzerodt accepted his part in the plan even if he lost his nerve, and that his silence afterward helped the killers. For jurors trained in war's discipline, intent and association weigh heavily alongside actual blows struck. David Herold's role appears clearly when witnesses place him guiding Powell through Washington streets and then riding with Booth into the Maryland night. Herold is young and sometimes appears weak or confused before the court, but his movements show that he chose to support the plot. He stayed with Booth at key moments, carried weapons, and helped navigate the farms and ferries that marked their escape route. To the officers on the commission, this loyalty to Booth in the days after the murder outweighs any claim that he was a helpless follower. Dr. Samuel Mudd's situation is more complex, sitting between medical duty, political sympathy, and choices that seem to hide more than they reveal. Evidence shows that he treated Booth's broken leg and provided shelter shortly after the assassination, then failed to report this visit promptly to authorities. Witnesses also recall earlier meetings between Booth and Mudd, including discussions of land and perhaps more shadowed topics, which raise suspicion about his innocence. Outside the courtroom, neighbors argue over whether he is a kindly country doctor caught in events or a willing friend to assassination. Other defendants, like Michael O'Loughlin, Samuel Arnold, and Edmund Spangler, face accusations of earlier plots to kidnap Lincoln or of giving small but real assistance. Spangler, who worked at Ford's Theatre handling scenery and stage hardware, is accused of helping Booth prepare his escape inside the building. In these cases, the evidence feels thinner and more tangled, and even some on the commission hesitate over how harshly to punish minor figures. Yet the scale of national grief and anger presses on every decision like weight on a set of scales, almost impossible to ignore. Throughout the proceedings, lawyers for the defense push back against the military setting, arguing that civilians should be tried in regular courts under ordinary rules. They note that Booth is already dead, that martial law was never declared across the whole country, and that hanging suspects after a military trial could leave doubts. Supporters of the commission answer that Washington was effectively a fortified camp, that the plot was born in treason, and that swift justice will calm a shaken nation. Behind these arguments lie deeper questions about rights, fear, and how a democracy responds when its leader is killed in such a public way. Outside the fortress walls, the nation follows each twist of the trial through printed testimony that stretches across pages in small, neat type. People in cities, gather at newsstands and kitchen tables to read the words of witnesses as if they were listening from the back row of the courtroom. In smaller towns, a newspaper might pass from hand to hand, while one reader with a clear voice recites the latest report aloud for neighbors. For many, the trial becomes a shared storyline that helps them work through their anger and sorrow by assigning blame to named faces. As weeks pass, witnesses for the defense try to soften this picture, offering accounts of kind deeds, peaceful habits, and seeming ignorance among some defendants. Priests speak for Mary Surratt's piety, neighbors remember her charity, and relatives say that a woman tied to her home could not mastermind such a plot. Friends of Mud describe a gentle doctor who once helped neighbors without pay and who now stands bewildered at the center of accusations. Even some Unionists worry that the thirst for punishment may sweep minor participants along with the clearly guilty, leaving later generations to question the fairness. As June draws on, the Commission retires to weigh the evidence, filling pages with findings and recommendations for President Andrew Johnson. Outside the Arsenal's walls, Washington swelters in the early summer heat, and the city waits for word on who will live and who will die. When the verdicts are announced, 4 defendants receive sentences of death by hanging, including Powell, Herold, Atzerodt, and Mary Surratt. Mudd, O'Loughlin, Arnold, and Spangler receive prison terms of varying lengths, punishments still severe, but short of the gallows. Appeals for clemency arrive at the White House, especially on behalf of Mary Surratt, whose family and supporters argue that executing a woman will stain the nation's conscience. Some on the commission recommend that her sentence be changed to life in prison, but the final power lies with President Johnson. Johnson, facing pressure from Stanton and others, and conscious of the anger still alive in the North, allows the executions to proceed. The choice will echo for decades as people debate whether mercy or firmness would have better served a country trying to heal. On the morning of July 7th, spectators gather inside the Arsenal walls as the 4 condemned are led to a scaffold built in the prison yard. Hoods are placed over their faces, prayers are spoken, and the trapdoor falls, leaving stillness where voices once argued. For many Americans, these hangings close the chapter of immediate revenge and open a longer struggle over memory, Reconstruction, and blame itself. Lincoln's assassination left the United States facing peace without the leader who had guided it through 4 years of war. And the early months of Reconstruction in 1865 unfolded under new hands in Washington. Across the Capitol, black crepe and silent crowds marked mourning, yet officials still had to decide how a shattered Union would be put back together. Their decisions would shape victory without his steady hand at the center for generations. In the hours after Lincoln's assassination, Andrew Johnson took the oath of office and became president, a Southern Unionist with a rough manner and a deep belief in the rights of white states over strong federal direction. Where Lincoln had balanced radicals and moderates with patient listening, Johnson carried old resentments against wealthy planters and an open disdain for black political equality. Under him, Reconstruction leaned toward fast reunion and weak guarantees for the freed. At first, many Northerners, still stunned by Lincoln's assassination, trusted Johnson's hard talk about traitors and believed he would punish Confederate leaders while safeguarding the results of war. He spoke harshly about hanging powerful rebels, words that sounded satisfying in cities where families still read casualty lists and passed fresh black ribbons to neighbors. Yet his vision of punishment focused more on individuals than on changing the structures of Southern society that had supported slavery through the summer and autumn of 1865, while grief for Lincoln's assassination still colored public ceremony. Johnson used his executive power to launch what became known as presidential Reconstruction. He issued broad amnesty to many former Confederates who swore loyalty to the Union, requiring only that a small group of top leaders ask him personally for special pardons. Southern states were urged to rebuild governments quickly, writing new constitutions under mostly white leadership. As new legislatures met in courthouses scarred by war, many white Southerners treated Lincoln's assassination as a closed book and assumed that reunion would leave their old racial order largely intact. They passed laws soon known as Black Codes, which restricted where freed people could work, live, and travel, and often forced them into labor contracts that echoed slavery in everything but name. Northern visitors saw vagrancy rules return and feared freedom's promises were fading. In Washington, many who had admired Lincoln's cautious empathy began to see that his death and the new president's choices were leaving freed people exposed, so they looked to Congress and to the Freedmen's Bureau for stronger protection. The Bureau's officers, scattered across the South in plain offices and field tents, tried to mediate labor contracts, distribute rations, open schools, and intervene when white authorities refused justice to black families. They soon felt their limits. Radical Republicans in Congress, who had long pushed Lincoln to strike slavery harder and faster, looked at the combination of Lincoln's assassination, Johnson's lenient approach, and Southern black codes, and decided that Reconstruction must be seized from the White House. They celebrated the 13th Amendment, which had abolished slavery, but they also understood that without political rights, land, and legal backing, freedom could be hollow, easily bent by local courts and sheriffs. Harder plans formed. In early Reconstruction fights, the shadow of Lincoln's assassination hung over every exchange as Congress proposed a Civil Rights Act in 1866 that promised citizenship and equal protection for black Americans. Johnson vetoed the bill, declaring that it went too far, that it favored black people over white citizens, and that the federal government should not interfere so deeply in state affairs. For the first time, Congress overrode him on a major question. Continuing clashes over how to answer Lincoln's assassination helped push Congress toward the 14th Amendment, which defined citizenship, promised equal protection, and threatened to reduce representation for states that denied voting rights to male citizens. When Southern legislatures, shaped by Johnson, rejected or stalled on this amendment, radical Republicans concluded that new state governments would have to be built from the ground up under firmer federal rules. Reconstruction Acts placed the South under military districts. In this more assertive phase, which unfolded in the years after Lincoln's assassination, Union troops supervised elections, and new biracial conventions gathered in halls where enslaved people had once been sold outside on nearby streets. Freedmen lined up to vote under the watch of soldiers, some holding their hats carefully, some bringing sons so they could remember the date when their family first took part in choosing leaders. Black men soon served proudly as legislators. White resistance hardened in answer, and some Southerners invoked Lincoln's assassination as proof that federal rule brought only turmoil, saying that Washington could not protect its own president and should not rule their towns. Secret societies like the Ku Klux Klan grew in the night, their members riding masked through pine woods and across sandy roads to terrorize black voters, teachers, and officials who tried to claim new rights. Soldiers and agents were not everywhere. In the North, as years passed after Lincoln's assassination, many voters grew tired of constant conflict over Southern policy and began to focus again on economic growth, railroads, and their own local concerns. For some, images of black legislators and federal troops in Southern streets felt distant and confusing, and they listened when the politicians blamed corruption or high taxes on Reconstruction governments rather than on wartime devastation. Support for strong federal oversight slowly softened everywhere. Tensions between Congress and Johnson rose steadily, fed by clashing visions of how to respond to Lincoln's assassination and by personal insults that hardened into open hostility. Johnson toured the country attacking his critics in speeches that mixed self-pity with defiance, prompting newspapers to compare him unfavorably with the calm dignity people associated with the murdered president. When he tried to remove Secretary Stanton, Congress answered with impeachment for alleged serious abuse of power. The Senate trial of Johnson became a national drama layered atop the older grief for Lincoln's assassination, and people crowded galleries or read transcripts to see whether he would be removed. In the end, he survived by a single vote, kept in office but weakened, a warning rather than an active partner in shaping the last years of Reconstruction from the White House. Real direction now came from Congress and from events in Southern towns. By 1870, the 15th Amendment extended voting rights to black men on paper nationwide. Another measure passed in a climate still shaped by memories of Lincoln's assassination and the question of how to secure Union victory. In some regions, this promise took real, if fragile, form, as black voters helped send representatives to state capitals and to Congress, even while facing threats, lost jobs, and attacks. Elsewhere, fraud and fear blunted the amendment's reach. On the ground in former slave states, Reconstruction without Lincoln's personal guidance meant small, fragile experiments in freedom carried out in a landscape still dominated by cotton, debt, and the memory of overseers. Many freed families entered sharecropping arrangements, working plots of land in return for a portion of the crop, while merchants advanced supplies on credit, creating cycles of obligation that were hard to escape. The hope of owning land rarely became reality there. As Reconstruction governments struggled, white Southerners who had once celebrated secession began to craft a softer story about their defeat, one that often sidestepped Lincoln's assassination and focused instead on noble generals, loyal slaves, and tragic loss. These early tales, shared in parlors and on courthouse steps, would grow into the lost cause tradition, making the Confederacy seem romantic while treating slavery and black rights as side issues rather than central facts. That battle lasted. Over time, the focus of reconciliation shifted from protecting black rights to healing white divisions, a change that unfolded in the decades after Lincoln's assassination, as new generations grew up with stories instead of direct memories of the war. The disputed election of 1876 and the compromise that followed marked a turning point, as federal troops were withdrawn from remaining Reconstruction states and local white leaders regained fuller control. Black citizens felt retreat because Lincoln's assassination removed him before the hardest Reconstruction battles. Americans have long wondered how the process might have unfolded if he had lived, and whether his blend of mercy and firmness could have prevented some later betrayals. No one can know that answer, and historians point out that Lincoln faced limits, prejudice, and political realities, yet his skill at building coalitions may have steadied the transition and softened some clashes between branches. People wonder. What is clear is that Reconstruction without Lincoln's steady presence became a patchwork of bold federal laws, brave local efforts, and fierce resistance, rather than a more unified project anchored by a single, widely trusted leader. Freed people carved out communities, churches, schools, and political clubs that would nurture their descendants, even when later regimes tried to strip away rights, drawing strength from one another when national support weakened. Their work kept emancipation alive quietly. In the years that followed, the nation layered new events over the raw wound opened by Lincoln's assassination, from industrial booms and strikes to Western expansion and conflicts with native nations. Yet the choices made in those first Reconstruction years without Lincoln's guidance shaped who could vote, where families could live, and how power was divided long after the black crepe came down from doors. They set patterns future generations would challenge or accept quietly. As Reconstruction shifted and then faded, people across the United States began to fix Lincoln's assassination in memory less as a recent crime and more as a symbolic turning point when one path closed and another, more uncertain path opened. In homes, churches, and public squares, stories gathered around his figure as mourners turned the practical questions of Reconstruction into broader reflections on sacrifice, leadership, and what kind of country the Union victory should create. Lincoln's assassination began to settle into American memory almost as soon as the black crepe came down from doorways and windows. In the years after 1865, grief turned into stories, and stories turned into symbols that tried to explain what his life and violent death meant for Americans. Funeral trains and public mourning for Lincoln had already built the first layer of shared remembrance, carrying his coffin past fields, factories, and small towns. As the train rolled through the night, people knelt on embankments, held lanterns, and watched the passing car as if watching the war itself depart. City after city draped buildings in black and white fabric, filling streets with slow processions, muffled drums, and the faint scent of crushed flowers. In crowded viewing lines, some mourners wept aloud, some stood dry-eyed, and others watched in stunned quiet, sensing that an age was closing for them. In churches and meeting halls, ministers and speakers began to describe Lincoln as a kind of national martyr, a leader who gave his life as the war ended. Sermons compared him to figures from scripture and history, even while families in pews still felt his loss in very ordinary ways. For many Black Americans, the memory of Lincoln after the assassination was not distant or abstract, but tied to the moment papers and soldiers first announced emancipation. In simple houses with plank floors, families pinned his image near doorways, beside Bible verses and pictures of sons gone to war forever. Newly freed communities in the South sometimes marked his birthday with songs, sermons, and small parades along dusty lanes. Children marched behind handmade banners, while elders spoke about the tall man in the photograph who had signed papers in a distant capital and changed the course of their lives forever. Among former Confederates, memories of Lincoln's assassination sat uneasily beside memories of loss in battle and harsh occupation. Some white Southerners told their children that they had mourned the president as a gentle enemy, while others said little, focusing instead on ruined houses, empty fields, and the struggle to rebuild. In later decades, some advocates of the lost cause tradition preferred to tell stories of noble Confederate generals rather than of a murdered Union president. Yet even in those homes, the fact of Lincoln's death in a theater remained, a fixed point they could neither celebrate openly nor fully erase. As years passed, memory of Lincoln's assassination began to take visible shape in stone, bronze, and carefully framed photographs. Cities named schools, streets, and counties for him, while local sculptors carved his profile on courthouse walls or placed simple busts in library reading rooms filled with tall shelves of books. At the physical sites of the assassination, memory took a more intimate form as visitors sought to touch the places where events unfolded. Ford's Theatre and the Petersen House across the street passed through private hands, alterations, neglect before preservation efforts slowly turned them into spaces of careful remembrance there. Publishers quickly realized that the story of Lincoln's assassination and his rise from poverty to the presidency could fill bookshelves. Early biographies and illustrated pamphlets showed a log cabin, a small law office, and the White House, inviting readers to see a journey from rough boards to polished desks inside. Over time, stories about prophetic dreams and strange omens clustered around the assassination, adding a softer layer of legend to the bare facts. People repeated tales of Lincoln dreaming about a funeral in the White House or speaking of his own death while walking the dim corridors late at night. These stories did not change what happened on Good Friday, yet they helped listeners feel that the tragedy fit into a larger pattern. In parlors lit by oil lamps, people leaned forward as neighbors repeated each detail, turning the president's private reflections into shared hints of destiny and warning together. Artists added their own visions, printing lithographs that showed Lincoln as a calm, almost saintly figure surrounded by allegorical figures and banners. In some prints, he stood beside George Washington in flowing robes, hand on a document, while angels or grieving women symbolized the Union's sorrow at his violent end. Such images could smooth away the complicated parts of his record, turning Lincoln into a figure of pure sacrifice rather than a politician who made difficult, sometimes controversial choices. In schoolrooms where these pictures hung, children learned to see him first as the man who died for the Union itself. As later political battles unfolded over Reconstruction, industrialization, and civil rights, different groups reached back to Lincoln's image and his assassination to support their arguments. In crowded campaign halls, speakers pointed to portraits on the wall, claiming that their policies best honored his memory or completed his unfinished work ideals. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a common picture of Lincoln as the great emancipator and gentle martyr had taken hold across much of the North. Yet popular histories downplayed black agency in winning freedom and rarely mentioned the racism that shaped the world he tried to change. In the South, as white reconciliation with the North advanced, some leaders began to praise Lincoln's moderation while condemning the radicals who followed him. At dedication ceremonies for soldiers' monuments and courthouses, speakers sometimes described Lincoln as a man who would have been kind to the defeated if spared alive. The most visible monument to the memory shaped by Lincoln's assassination rose slowly beside the reflecting pool in Washington during the early 20th century. The Lincoln Memorial's marble columns, broad steps, and central seated statue presented him as a calm, contemplative guardian, looking out over the Capitol with distant patience. Inside, carved inscriptions of the Gettysburg Address and his second inaugural address wrapped visitors in his own words about sacrifice, slavery, and a just peace. Standing on the cool stone floor, people could look up at his face and feel both the distance of history and the nearness of loss. Over time, the memorial became not only a shrine to Lincoln's assassination and life, but also a stage for new struggles over American freedom. When singers and speakers stood on its steps, from Marian Anderson to the marchers of 1963, they linked their demands to his unfinished promises. Back on 10th Street, Ford's Theatre eventually reopened as a museum and working stage, blending performance with reflection on the night of the assassination. School groups filed past the preserve box and across the street to the Petersen House, where narrow rooms and simple furniture made the story feel immediate. In the Petersen House, the small bedroom where Lincoln died became a focus of quiet pilgrimage, its narrow bed and modest decorations carefully arranged. Visitors looked at the quilt, chair, and clock, imagining that long night when leaders whispered, doctors worked, and the United States waited in the hallway outside. The places touched by Booth's flight carried a different, more troubled memory, one that communities sometimes preferred to handle quietly rather than honor openly. Farmhouses, taverns, and ferry landings connected to his escape route drew curious visitors, yet many locals framed their stories carefully, stressing loyalty and regret over time. Families of the condemned conspirators also lived within the shadow of Lincoln's assassination, carrying names that stirred argument whenever they appeared in print. Descendants of Mary Surratt and Dr. Mudd, for example, sometimes worked to clear reputations through petitions, letters, and local histories, while neighbors quietly debated what justice required. Meanwhile, historians kept returning to Lincoln's assassination, revising earlier accounts as new documents surfaced and new questions arose about race, power, and memory. In the 20th century, Black scholars and activists increasingly challenged the simple martyr story, insisting that any honest remembrance include the efforts of enslaved people and soldiers. Popular culture kept the theatre box and the fatal shot before new generations through plays, novels, and films that dramatized the night again and again. In movies and television scenes, actors in stovepipe hats and frock coats revisited Ford's Theatre, turning the balcony into one of America's most familiar stages. Curators and educators often wrestled with how to present Lincoln's assassination without turning tragedy into spectacle, especially for young visitors. Museum displays balance the pistol, playbill, and blood-stained artifacts with letters, photographs, and quiet explanations, trying to keep attention on lives disrupted rather than on the instruments of harm. On school trips, children often asked direct questions about why anyone would want to kill a president, and guides answered in simple words about hatred and fear. Standing in the shadowed theatre, students looked up at the balcony rail and then back at the stage, measuring distance with their eyes. Anniversaries of Lincoln's assassination offered moments for communities to pause, ring bells, and place wreaths where crowds once stood in shock. On significant dates, people gathered at Ford's Theatre, the Lincoln Memorial, or small town squares, listening as readers took them back through the timeline of April 1865. Modern historians have tried to hold together both the reverence surrounding Lincoln's assassination and the harder questions about his limits, allies, and context. In quiet reading rooms and classrooms, they compare speeches, letters, and testimonies, showing how his leadership grew within a country shaped by deep racism and conflict beneath. Some Americans today question whether the older martyr story has sometimes been used to settle consciences too quickly, covering over unfinished work, yet they still walk under statues, study portraits, and visit theatres, trying to understand how one leader's life and death continue to echo in debates about justice today. As Lincoln's assassination moved further into the past, the monuments, stories, and rituals that grew around it helped Americans decide who they believed themselves to be. In quiet galleries and on busy steps, people still face his memory and the questions it raises about safety, leadership, and shared responsibility ahead. Lincoln's assassination forced the United States to think differently about how it protected its presidents, turning one terrible night at Ford's Theatre into the starting point for a long, uneven journey toward modern security. In those days, a president could walk Washington streets with only a few guards nearby and attend plays in open boxes above a cheerful crowd. The idea of an invisible shield around a leader had barely formed. That would slowly change. In the weeks after Lincoln's assassination, grief and anger mixed with a simpler realization that access to presidents could no longer remain so open. Soldiers guarded the White House gates more closely and accompanied Andrew Johnson through streets that held funeral drapery. Visitors who once wandered easily into waiting rooms now met sterner attendants in plain coats. Yet protection was still a patchwork, dependent on local commanders, personal habits, and the mood of the moment. Long before Lincoln's assassination, individual guards, police, and private detectives had sometimes shielded presidents, yet no permanent system existed. During the war, Alan Pinkerton's men watched over Lincoln on certain journeys, even uncovering a rumored plot in Baltimore years earlier. Those efforts were temporary, like scaffolding around a building that no one planned to reinforce. After 1865, the country began to see that protection could not rely on scattered favors and personal bravery. Only months after Lincoln's assassination, Congress created the United States Secret Service, though its first mission was to pursue counterfeiters who weakened the nation's money. Agents traveled quietly through towns, following forged bills and suspicious printers, rarely thinking about guarding presidents. Over time, however, the skills they developed in investigation, disguise, and travel would prove useful in a different kind of protection. History would pull them from back rooms toward the center of public life. A generation after Lincoln's assassination, the shooting of James Garfield in 1881 again exposed how exposed presidents remained in train stations and public halls. Garfield was approached at close range by a disappointed seeker of office, while he moved through a crowd with only light guard. His long, painful decline reminded Americans that a single bullet could leave the government drifting. Pressure grew quietly for more organized, reliable protection around the office itself. When William McKinley was shot in 1901 while greeting fair visitors in Buffalo, the echo of Lincoln's assassination and Garfield's death finally pushed change into law. Crowds had pressed close to his outstretched hand, so close that a man hiding a pistol in a wrapped handkerchief could fire twice. After McKinley died, Congress quietly directed the Secret Service to guard presidents full-time. What had been occasional assistance became a daily, organized duty. In the early years after McKinley's death, protection still looked simple by modern standards, yet its outline would be recognizable to us. Plainclothes agents watched doorways and crowds, rode in carriages and then open cars, and studied faces in hotel lobbies and train depots. Local police helped hold lines as presidents passed, forming chains that sometimes bent under pressure. The focus remained on being near the president's shoulder, rather than on controlling every distant threat. Over the 20th century, echoes of Lincoln's assassination resurfaced whenever threats arose, reminding officials why protection mattered beyond party or personality. Gradually, Congress expanded the Secret Service role to cover not only presidents, but their families, visiting dignitaries, and former leaders who still drew public crowds. Each change recognized that danger could linger long after a term ended. Security became a quiet, continual presence, woven into the rhythms of official life and travel everywhere worldwide. Yet even with lessons drawn from Lincoln's assassination, later decades brought painful reminders that protection could never be perfect. In 1950, attackers approached the home where Harry Truman was staying, and Secret Service agents exchanged gunfire on a quiet Washington street. In 1963, John Kennedy was killed while riding in an open car through Dallas, an image that stunned the world. Investigations examined motorcades, routes, and the balance between visibility and safety. After the Kennedy assassination, and later, after the attempt on Ronald Reagan, protective thinking deepened in ways that reflected both fear and determination. Agents trained more intensely, studied how crowds move, and worked with local police to shape safer approaches to speeches and visits. Vehicles, buildings, and travel plans were evaluated with new care. The aim was not to create a cage, but to wrap each appearance in layers of quiet, mostly unseen preparation carefully. In modern times, the legacy of Lincoln's assassination can be felt whenever a president appears in public, even if most people sense it as patient waiting and distant barriers. Long before a visit, teams study maps, talk with local officials, and quietly adjust schedules and entrances. Technology helps sift through information, watching for patterns and warnings that might otherwise remain hidden. Every step aims to let the president greet citizens while still returning safely home. Ford's Theatre itself became part of this changing story of safety after Lincoln's assassination, its future debated in Congress and in nearby homes. Some feared that continuing performances there would feel disrespectful, while others worried that preserving the building might invite fascination. For a time, the theatre closed and the government used the structure for offices and storage. The balcony box remained a symbol, a reminder of how vulnerable a leader could be in view. Within the protective world, Lincoln's assassination and later attacks became case studies that instructors returned to again and again when training new generations. The story of the unguarded corridor at Ford's Theatre, of the absent policeman, and of the open box above the stage illustrated how small gaps could invite catastrophe. Trainees learned to picture the space, the movement, and the timing. Each retelling turned remembered failure into a quiet guide for future planning everywhere. The deeper meaning drawn from Lincoln's assassination was not simply that presidents need guards, but that a republic must balance openness and safety with care. Citizens expect to see their leaders at parades, factories, schools, and storm-damaged neighborhoods, not only on distant screens. Each handshake and smile connects office to ordinary life. At the same time, security teams quietly shape how close that contact can safely be, adjusting plans when tension rises inwardly everywhere. For ordinary people who line sidewalks or pass through checkpoints, the distant memory of Lincoln's assassination may feel abstract, yet its influence touches their patience. Waiting in slowly moving lines, opening bags, and passing through arches can feel like small chores attached to any modern political event. Behind those routines stands a long history of lessons written in sorrow. Each calm, uneventful day on a president's schedule is a quiet sign that the lessons hold. In the information age, reflections on Lincoln's assassination intersect with newer concerns about messages that travel quickly and threats planned far from any podium. Protective work now includes watching public statements, letters, and online spaces for signs of people who fixate on leaders in ways. Specialists coordinate with mental health professionals and local authorities, trying to respond early when words hint at harm. The goal remains to steer individuals toward help and keep events peaceful. Visitors who tour the modern White House grounds walk through a setting shaped by both hospitality and the memory of Lincoln's assassination. Fences, cameras, and quiet offices are part of the landscape, yet so are flower beds, school groups, and the distant sound of city traffic. The building remains a home as well as a workplace. Inside, staff and agents work together so that children can wave from the fence without fearing what lies beyond. The lessons that grew from Lincoln's assassination also fit into a wider story, since other nations have faced violence against leaders and reshaped security in response. American officials sometimes study those events as they refine their own safeguards, looking for patterns that cross borders. At the same time, they remember that each country's history and landscape are different. The memory of one theater in Washington remains bound to the American struggle with safety and openness. For the agents who now spend long days and nights protecting presidents, the connection to Lincoln's assassination is not always spoken, yet it threads through their mission. They stand beside vehicles in rain, walk hotel corridors, and scan balconies, often unnoticed by the people they guard. Many miss family events to stay on post. Their work is successful when nothing happens, when a quiet evening speech ends with applause and an ordinary drive back home. If we trace the line from Lincoln's assassination to a present-day motorcade, we can picture how Washington itself has changed along with security. The same streets that once saw Lincoln stroll with minimal escort now carry armored vehicles, motorcycles, and layered police presence. Buildings are taller, crowds larger, and information flows faster. Yet in both eras, citizens still pause on sidewalks to watch a president pass, wondering privately about the burdens carried inside today. People who visit Ford's Theatre today sometimes leave with a gentle unease, aware that a joyful evening can shift suddenly into history. For many, that feeling brings not fear, but a quiet gratitude for the protections now in place, even when they cause delay. Standing under the balcony, they picture the past and the layers of change that followed. Out in the city, those layers continued to grow, shaped by memory and watchful care nearby. Across more than a century, Lincoln's assassination has quietly guided each decision about how far to open a doorway, how high to build a barrier, and how close a president should stand to a cheering crowd. It turned one leader's final walk into a lasting cautionary tale. Today, every peaceful inauguration, school visit, and simple walk to a waiting car carries that memory nearby, shaping a safer stage for the wider story of American life. In the long years since Lincoln's assassination, Americans have carried its story into new centuries and new debates. At first, it lived in fresh grief and in the black crepe that hung over city streets. But with time, it settled into schoolbooks, paintings, and quiet family talk. Each generation has returned to that April night and the days that followed, looking for lessons about leadership, risk, hatred, and the fragile nature of public life. At classroom desks, students hear about Lincoln's assassination as they learn the broader Civil War story and see his face in faded portraits near the chalkboard. Teachers describe the theater, the pistol, the long vigil in the Petersen House, and they try to answer quick questions from children who are still meeting these names for the first time. Some lessons linger on dates and vocabulary, while others pause to ask how it felt to wake up in a country whose leader had lost his life overnight. In many homes, Lincoln's assassination enters family memory through small objects rather than formal lessons. A framed print above a mantel, a worn book of speeches, or a handed-down story about an ancestor who lined the tracks to watch the funeral train keeps the moment close. Around kitchen tables, elders sometimes describe how their own grandparents spoke about that week of bells and black banners, linking the listener to a chain of voices that reaches back more than a century. When people today talk about political violence, Lincoln's assassination often appears beside more recent attacks as a reference point. Commentators remember the unguarded theater box, the absent officer at the door, and the way one determined man was able to alter the course of national leadership with a single act. The story reminds listeners that public life always carries some risk, no matter how strong institutions seem, and that words of hatred can prepare the ground for real harm. That awareness sits quietly behind many modern security choices. In discussions about race and justice, people also return to Lincoln's assassination for what it changed and what it could never complete. Some historians argue that his death opened the door for harsher policies and deeper betrayals of black citizens, while others note that even his gentler plans faced strong resistance. In classrooms, students compare presidential speeches with later laws and court cases and see how far the distance can be between hopeful words and daily reality. The assassination becomes part of a longer story about promises kept and promises abandoned. Across the United States, local museums and historical societies tell parts of the story in their own ways. A small town in the Midwest might display a ribbon saved from the funeral procession, while a Maryland county courthouse keeps documents from the manhunt and the trials. Visitors lean over glass cases to read faded ink or study a simple chair that once stood in a boarding house, trying to picture the people who sat there. In these quiet rooms, Lincoln's assassination feels less like a distant headline and more like a series of choices made by ordinary hands. At Ford's Theater in Washington, Lincoln's assassination is remembered every day as tourists file through the doors and sit for a moment in the dimly lit hall. Guides point out the presidential box, the stage, and the narrow door that Booth used, speaking in even tones so the space can hold both education and respect. Across the street, the Petersen House remains small and close, its rooms tight with beds, chairs, and the memory of officials gathered around a fading leader. Many visitors leave speaking more softly than when they arrived. When later presidents and national figures lost their lives to violence, Americans often reach back to Lincoln's assassination as an earlier chapter in the same troubling pattern. After the deaths of James Garfield, William McKinley, John Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., and Robert Kennedy, newspapers drew lines across decades, comparing security, motives, and public grief. Families watched televised funerals and processions and thought about that earlier coffin borne on a slow train through darkened fields. The repetition of loss deepened a sense that leadership in the United States can be both powerful and strangely exposed. Scholars have spent lifetimes revisiting the records around Lincoln's assassination, checking testimonies, diaries, and official reports against one another. They map Booth's movements with care, weigh the fairness of the military trials, and explore how politics and fear shaped each decision. At the same time, myths and conspiracy theories have grown in the gaps that remain, suggesting deeper plots or foreign hands where most historians see no solid evidence. The tension between careful research and dramatic rumor is itself part of how the story lives on. Because Lincoln's assassination involved a network of conspirators and unfolded at the end of a civil war, some people have long suspected that hidden sponsors must stand behind the known plot. Over the years, writers have accused foreign governments, secret societies, or distant political figures of guiding Booth's actions from the shadows. When historians test these claims against documents, letters, and timelines, they usually find more speculation than substance, even while acknowledging that not every question can be answered with certainty. The mainstream view still holds that Booth and his small circle acted on their own, driven by intense beliefs and the chaos of defeat. In quieter civic spaces, Lincoln's assassination serves as a warning about the power of words and the responsibilities that come with public disagreement. Teachers, clergy, and community leaders sometimes point out that Booth did not act in a vacuum, but in an environment where anger at Lincoln was shouted from pulpits, newspapers, and tavern stools. They remind listeners that sharp criticism can be part of democracy, while language that treats opponents as less than human can feed darker impulses. The story becomes a gentle prompt to notice how we speak about one another when tensions rise. Artists, writers, and filmmakers still return to Lincoln's assassination because it holds so many human threads within a single night. They see the actor who chose violence, the president seeking a brief rest after years of war, the young doctor pushing through a crowd to help, and the many onlookers whose lives would be divided into before and after. Each retelling chooses a slightly different angle, sometimes centering Booth's obsession, sometimes Mary's grief, sometimes the city's fear. Over time, these portrayals shape how people imagine the event, even if they never read a formal history book. In political speeches and civic holidays, references to Lincoln's assassination often sit alongside quotations from his addresses, blending the memory of his words with the shock of his death. Leaders invoke his patience, his humor, or his resolve, then remind audiences that such a figure lost his life while trying to guide the country through reunion. Some use that contrast to argue for patience with one another now, suggesting that shared goals can survive even bitter divisions. Others draw sharper lessons about the need to defend institutions against those who would rather break them than lose an argument. For individuals, meeting the story of Lincoln's assassination often stirs a quiet mix of sadness and recognition. Standing in the theater or the small bedroom across the street, or even reading a letter from that week in an archive or online, people feel how suddenly ordinary routines can rupture. A simple decision to attend a play, a guard stepping away from a post, a rider arriving a little too late, all become part of one chain. The details remind visitors that history is not only made in grand halls, but also in narrow stairways and crowded streets. Teachers and parents sometimes use Lincoln's assassination as a starting point for conversations with young people about empathy and civic duty. They talk about Booth not only as a villain, but as a person who allowed his anger and prejudice to harden until he could no longer see his target as fully human. They point to the many others in the story who chose differently, from the doctor who climbed to the balcony to the neighbors who opened their doors. In these small discussions, the 19th century event creates space for 21st century choices. Over time, the memory of Lincoln's assassination has become woven into a broader American habit of marking certain days as turning points. People speak of the attack almost in the same breath as other dates of crisis, not because the details match, but because each moment forced a reckoning. The pattern invites reflection on how a society responds when something sudden and violent tears through its plans. Some listeners find comfort in noticing that the country has faced such moments before and still found ways to continue. At the same time, Lincoln's assassination keeps the vulnerability of leaders visible in a way that statistics alone cannot. It reminds people that presidents walk through rooms, sit in chairs, and share jokes with friends only moments before decisions and accidents can change everything. That sense of nearness can soften the way some citizens think about the office, even when they strongly oppose a policy or a party. Remembering that a person stands inside the title can make the rituals of transfer and debate feel more precious. So much of the way Lincoln's assassination still lives in American life happens quietly, almost unnoticed, in simple moments. A visitor stands on the sidewalk outside Ford's Theatre late in the day, noticing the brick walls glowing in evening light while traffic hums past. A reader closes a book about the Civil War and absently touches the spine, thinking about how many families were changed by a bullet in a crowded room. A parent turning off a documentary makes a mental note to talk with a teenager about anger, compromise, and the paths people choose. From a distance, Lincoln's assassination can seem like a fixed story, sealed in photographs and museum glass. Up close, it is still part of how Americans talk about danger, courage, loss, and repair. Each time someone remembers that night with care, they help keep the past connected to the everyday choices of the present.